Volume 2, Section 4 of the Life of Charlotte Brontë. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bruce Peary. The Life of Charlotte Brontë by Elizabeth Gaskell. Volume 2, Section 4. The reason why Miss Brontë was so anxious to preserve her secret was, I am told, that she had pledged her word to her sisters that it should not be revealed through her. The dilemmas attendant on the publication of the sisters' novels under assumed names were increasing upon them. Many critics insisted on believing that all the fictions published as by Three Bells were the works of one author, but written at different periods of his development and maturity. No doubt this suspicion affected the reception of the books. Ever since the completion of Anne Brontë's tale of Agnes Grey, she had been labouring at a second, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. It is little known. The subject, the deterioration of a character whose profligacy and ruin took their rise in habits of intemperance so slight as to be only considered good fellowship, was painfully discordant to one who would fain have sheltered herself from all but peaceful and religious ideas. She had, says her sister of that gentle little one, in the course of her life been called on to contemplate near at hand, and for a long time, the terrible effects of talents misused and faculties abused. Hers was naturally a sensitive, reserved, and dejected nature. What she saw sunk very deeply into her mind. It did her harm. She brooded over it till she believed it to be a duty to reproduce every detail, of course with fictitious characters, incidents, and situations, as a warning to others. She hated her work, but would pursue it. When reasoned with on the subject, she regarded such reasonings as a temptation to self-indulgence. She must be honest. She must not varnish, soften, or conceal. This well-meant resolution brought on her misconstruction and some abuse, which she bore, as it was her custom to bear whatever was unpleasant, with mild, steady patience. She was a very sincere and practical Christian, but the tinge of religious melancholy communicated a sad shade to her brief, blameless life. In the June of this year, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall was sufficiently near its completion to be submitted to the person who had previously published for Ellis and Acton Bell. In consequence of his mode of doing business, considerable annoyance was occasioned both to Miss Brontë and to them. The circumstances, as detailed in a letter of hers to a friend in New Zealand, were these. One morning, at the beginning of July, a communication was received at the parsonage from Messrs. Smith and Elder, which disturbed its quiet inmates not a little, as, though the matter brought under their notice was merely referred to as one which affected their literary reputation, they conceived it to have a bearing likewise upon their character. Jane Eyre had had a great run in America, and a publisher there had consequently bid high for early sheets of the next work by Currer Bell. These Messrs. Smith and Elder had promised to let him have. He was therefore greatly astonished, and not well pleased, to learn that a similar agreement had been entered into with another American house, and that the new tale was very shortly to appear. It turned out, upon inquiry, that the mistake had originated in Acton and Ellis Bell's publisher having assured this American house that, to the best of his belief, Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which he pronounced superior to either of the other two, were all written by the same author. Though Messrs. Smith and Elder distinctly stated in their letter that they did not share in such a belief, the sisters were impatient till they had shown its utter groundlessness, and set themselves perfectly straight. With rapid decision they resolved that Charlotte and Anne should start for London that very day, in order to prove their separate identity to Messrs. Smith and Elder, and demand from the credulous publisher his reasons for a belief so directly at variance with an assurance which had several times been given to him. Having arrived at this determination, they made their preparations with resolute promptness. There were many household duties to be performed that day, but they were all got through. The two sisters each packed up a change of dress in a small box, which they sent down to Keighley by an opportune cart, and after early tea they set off to walk thither, no doubt in some excitement, for, independently of the cause of their going to London, it was Anne's first visit there. A great thunderstorm overtook them on their way that summer evening to the station, but they had no time to seek shelter. They only just caught the train at Keighley, arrived at Leeds, and were whirled up by the night train to London. About 8 o'clock on the Saturday morning, they arrived at the Chapter Coffee House, Paternoster Row. A strange place, but they did not well know where else to go. They refreshed themselves by washing, and had some breakfast. Then they sat still for a few minutes to consider what next should be done. When they had been discussing their project in the quiet of Haworth Parsonage the day before, and planning the mode of setting about the business on which they were going to London, they had resolved to take a cab, if they should find it desirable, from their inn to Cornhill, but that amidst the bustle and queer state of inward excitement in which they found themselves, as they sat and considered their position on the Saturday morning, they quite forgot even the possibility of hiring a conveyance, and when they set forth, they became so dismayed by the crowded streets and the impeded crossings, that they stood still repeatedly, in complete despair of making progress, and were nearly an hour in walking the half-mile they had to go. Neither Mr. Smith nor Mr. Williams knew that they were coming. They were entirely unknown to the publishers of Jane Eyre, who were not, in fact, aware whether the Bells were men or women, but had always written to them as men. On reaching Mr. Smith's, Charlotte put his own letter into his hands, the same letter which had excited so much disturbance at Haworth Parsonage only 24 hours before. "Where did you get this?" said he, as if he could not believe that the two young ladies dressed in black, of slight figures and diminutive stature, looking pleased, yet agitated, could be the embodied Currer and Acton Bell, for whom curiosity had been hunting so eagerly in vain. An explanation ensued, and Mr. Smith at once began to form plans for their amusement and pleasure during their stay at London. He urged them to meet a few literary friends at his house, and this was a strong temptation to Charlotte, as amongst them were one or two of the writers whom she particularly wished to see, but her resolution to remain unknown induced her firmly to put it aside. The sisters were equally persevering in declining Mr. Smith's invitations to stay at his house. They refused to leave their quarters, saying they were not prepared for a long stay. When they returned back to their inn, poor Charlotte paid for the excitement of the interview, which had wound up the agitation and hurry of the last 24 hours, by a racking headache and harassing sickness. Towards evening, as she rather expected some of the ladies of Mr. Smith's family to call, she prepared herself for the chance by taking a strong dose of sal volatile, which roused her a little, but still, as she says, she was in grievous bodily case when their visitors were announced in full evening costume. The sisters had not understood that it had been settled that they were to go to the opera, and therefore were not ready. Moreover, they had no fine elegant dresses, either with them or in the world. But Miss Brontë resolved to raise no objections in the acceptance of kindness. So, in spite of headache and weariness, they made haste to dress themselves in their plain, high-made country garments. Charlotte says, in an account which she gives to her friend of this visit to London, describing the entrance of her party into the opera house: "Fine ladies and gentlemen glanced at us as we stood by the box door, which was not yet opened, with a slight, graceful superciliousness, quite warranted by the circumstances. Still, I felt pleasurably excited, in spite of headache, sickness, and conscious clownishness, and I saw Anne was calm and gentle, which she always is. The performance was Rossini's Barber of Seville, very brilliant, though I fancy there are things I should like better. We got home after 1 o'clock. We had never been in bed the night before, had been in constant excitement for 24 hours. You may imagine we were tired. The next day, Sunday, Mr. Williams came early to take us to church, and in the afternoon Mr. Smith and his mother fetched us in a carriage and took us to his house to dine. On Monday we went to the exhibition of the Royal Academy, the National Gallery, dined again at Mr. Smith's, and then went home to tea with Mr. Williams at his house. On Tuesday morning we left London, laden with books Mr. Smith had given us, and got safely home. A more jaded wretch than I looked it would be difficult to conceive. I was thin when I went, but I was meagre indeed when I returned, my face looking grey and very old, with strange deep lines ploughed in it. My eyes stared unnaturally. I was weak and yet restless. In a while, however, these bad effects of excitement went off, and I regained my normal condition." The impression Miss Brontë made upon those with whom she first became acquainted during this visit to London was of a person with clear judgment and fine sense, and though reserved, possessing unconsciously the power of drawing out others in conversation. She never expressed an opinion without assigning a reason for it. She never put a question without a definite purpose, and yet people felt at their ease in talking with her. All conversation with her was genuine and stimulating, and when she launched forth in praise or reprobation of books, or deeds, or works of art, her eloquence was indeed burning. She was thorough in all that she said or did, yet so open and fair in dealing with a subject or contending with an opponent, that instead of rousing resentment, she merely convinced her hearers of her earnest zeal for the truth and right. Not the least singular part of their proceedings was the place at which the sisters had chosen to stay. Paternoster Row was for many years sacred to publishers. It is a narrow flagged street, lying under the shadow of St. Paul's. At each end there are posts placed so as to prevent the passage of carriages, and thus preserve a solemn silence for the deliberations of the fathers of the row. The dull warehouses on each side are mostly occupied at present by wholesale stationers. If they be publishers' shops, they show no attractive front to the dark and narrow street. Half-way up, on the left-hand side, is the Chapter Coffee House. I visited it last June. It was then unoccupied. It had the appearance of a dwelling-house 200 years old or so, such as one sometimes sees in ancient country towns. The ceilings of the small rooms were low, and had heavy beams running across them. The walls were wainscoted breast-high. The staircase was shallow, broad, and dark, taking up much space in the centre of the house. This, then, was the Chapter Coffee House, which, a century ago, was the resort of all the booksellers and publishers, and where the literary hacks, the critics, and even the wits used to go in search of ideas or employment. This was the place about which Chatterton wrote in those delusive letters he sent to his mother at Bristol, while he was starving in London. I am quite familiar at the Chapter Coffee House, and know all the geniuses there. Here he heard of chances of employment. Here his letters were to be left. Years later it became the tavern frequented by university men and country clergymen who were up in London for a few days, and, having no private friends or access into society, were glad to learn what was going on in the world of letters from the conversation which they were sure to hear in the coffee-room. In Mr. Bronte's few and brief visits to town during his residence at Cambridge, and the period of his curacy in Essex, he had stayed at this house. Hither he had brought his daughters when he was convoying them to Brussels, and here they came now. From very ignorance where else to go. It was a place solely frequented by men. I believe there was but one female servant in the house. Few people slept there. Some of the stated meetings of the trade were held in it, as they had been for more than a century, and occasionally country booksellers, with now and then a clergyman, resorted to it, but it was a strange desolate place for the Miss Brontes to have gone to, from its purely business and masculine aspect. The old grey-haired elderly man who officiated as a waiter seems to have been touched from the very first with the quiet simplicity of the two ladies, and he tried to make them feel comfortable and at home in the long, low, dingy room upstairs, where the meetings of the trade were held. The high, narrow windows looked into the gloomy row. The sisters, clinging together on the most remote window-seat, as Mr. Smith tells me he found them when he came that Saturday morning to take them to the opera, could see nothing of motion or of change in the grim, dark houses opposite, so near and close, although the whole breadth of the row was between. The mighty roar of London was round them, like the sound of an unseen ocean, yet every footfall on the pavement below might be heard distinctly in that unfrequented street. Such as it was, they preferred remaining at the Chapter Coffee House to accepting the invitation which Mr. Smith and his mother urged upon them, and in after years Charlotte says, "Since those days I have seen the West End, the parks, the fine squares, but I love the city far better. The city seems so much more in earnest. Its business, its rush, its roar, are such serious things, sights, sounds. The city is getting its living, the West End but enjoying its pleasure. At the West End you may be amused, but in the city you are deeply excited." Villette, Volume 1, page 89. Their wish had been to hear Dr. Crowley on the Sunday morning, and Mr. Williams escorted them to St. Stephen's, Walbrook, but they were disappointed as Dr. Crowley did not preach. Mr. Williams also took them, as Miss Bronte has mentioned, to drink tea at his house. On the way thither they had to pass through Kensington Gardens, and Miss Bronte was much struck with the beauty of the scene, the fresh verdure of the turf, and the soft rich masses of foliage. From remarks on the different character of the landscape in the south to what it was in the north, she was led to speak of the softness and varied intonations of the voices of those with whom she conversed in London, which seemed to have made a strong impression on both sisters. All this time, those who came in contact with the Miss Browns, another pseudonym, also beginning with a B, seem only to have regarded them as shy and reserved little country women, with not much to say. Mr. Williams tells me that on the night when he accompanied the party to the opera, as Charlotte ascended the flight of stairs leading from the grand entrance up to the lobby of the first tier of boxes, she was so much struck with the architectural effect of the splendid decorations of that vestibule and saloon, that involuntarily she slightly pressed his arm, and whispered, "You know I am not accustomed to this sort of thing." Indeed, it must have formed a vivid contrast to what they were doing and seeing an hour or two earlier the night before, when they were trudging along with beating hearts and high-strung courage on the road between Haworth and Keighley, hardly thinking of the thunderstorm that beat above their heads, for the thoughts which filled them of how they would go straight away to London and prove that they were really two people and not one impostor. It was no wonder that they returned to Haworth utterly fagged and worn out, after the fatigue and excitement of this visit. The next notice I find of Charlotte's life at this time is of a different character to anything telling of enjoyment. July 28th. Branwell is the same in conduct as ever. His constitution seems much shattered. Papa, and sometimes all of us, have sad nights with him. He sleeps most of the day, and consequently will lie awake at night. But has not every house its trial? While her most intimate friends were yet in ignorance of the fact of her authorship of Jane Eyre, she received a letter from one of them, making inquiries about Casterton School. It is but right to give her answer, written on August 28th, 1848. Since you wish to hear from me while you are from home, I will write without further delay. It often happens that when we linger at first in answering a friend's letter, obstacles occur to retard us to an inexcusably late period. In my last, I forgot to answer a question which you asked me, and was sorry afterwards for the omission. I will begin, therefore, by replying to it, though I fear what information I can give will come a little late. You said Mrs. Blank had some thoughts of sending Blank to school, and wished to know whether the Clergy Daughters' School at Casterton was an eligible place. My personal knowledge of that institution is very much out of date, being derived from the experience of 20 years ago. The establishment was at that time in its infancy, and a sad rickety infancy it was. Typhus fever decimated the school periodically, and consumption and scrofula, in every variety of form bad air and water, bad and insufficient diet can generate, preyed on the ill-fated pupils. It would not then have been a fit place for any of Mrs. Blank's children, but I understand it is very much altered for the better since those days. The school is removed from Cowan Bridge, a situation as unhealthy as it was picturesque, low, damp, beautiful with wood and water, to Casterton. The accommodations, the diet, the discipline, the system of tuition, all are, I believe, entirely altered and greatly improved. I was told that such pupils as behaved well and remained at the school till their education was finished, were provided with situations as governesses, if they wished to adopt the vocation, and much care was exercised in the selection, it was added, that they were also furnished with an excellent wardrobe on leaving Casterton. The oldest family in Haworth failed lately, and have quitted the neighbourhood where their fathers resided before them for, it is said, 13 generations. Papa, I am most thankful to say, continues in very good health, considering his age. His sight, too, rather, I think, improves than deteriorates. My sisters, likewise, are pretty well. But the dark cloud was hanging over that doomed household, and gathering blackness every hour. On October the 9th she thus writes: "The past 3 weeks have been a dark interval in our humble home. Branwell's constitution had been failing fast all the summer, but still neither the doctors nor himself thought him so near his end as he was. He was entirely confined to his bed but for 1 single day, and was in the village 2 days before his death. He died, after 20 minutes' struggle, on Sunday morning, September 24th. He was perfectly conscious till the last agony came on. His mind had undergone the peculiar change which frequently precedes death 2 days previously. The calm of better feelings filled it. A return of natural affection marked his last moments. He is in God's hands now, and the all-powerful is likewise the all-merciful. A deep conviction that he rests at last, rests well, after his brief, erring, suffering, feverish life, fills and quiets my mind now. The final separation, the spectacle of his pale corpse, gave me more acute bitter pain than I could have imagined. Till the last hour comes, we never know how much we can forgive, pity, regret a near relative, All his vices were and are nothing now. We remember only his woes. Papa was acutely distressed at first, but on the whole has borne the event well. Emily and Anne are pretty well, though Anne is always delicate, and Emily has a cold and cough at present. It was my fate to sink at the crisis, when I should have collected my strength. Headache and sickness came on first on the Sunday. I could not regain my appetite. Then internal pain attacked me. I became at once much reduced. It was impossible to touch a morsel. At last bilious fever declared itself. I was confined to bed a week, a dreary week. But, thank God, health seems now returning. I can sit up all day and take moderate nourishment. The doctor said at first I should be very slow in recovering, but I seem to get on faster than he anticipated. I am truly much better. I have heard from one who attended Branwell in his last illness that he resolved on standing up to die. He had repeatedly said that as long as there was life there was strength of will to do what it chose, and when the last agony came on he insisted on assuming the position just mentioned. I have previously stated that when his fatal attack came on, his pockets were found filled with old letters from the woman to whom he was attached. He died, she lives still, in Mayfair. The Eumenides, I suppose, went out of existence at the time when the wail was heard, "Great Pan is dead." I think we could better have spared him than those awful sisters who sting dead conscience into life. I turn from her for ever. Let us look once more into the parsonage at Haworth. October 29th, 1848. I think I have now nearly got over the effects of my late illness, and am almost restored to my normal condition of health. I sometimes wish that it was a little higher, but we ought to be content with such blessings as we have, and not pine after those that are out of our reach. I feel much more uneasy about my sister than myself just now. Emily's cold and cough are very obstinate. I fear she has pain in her chest, and I sometimes catch a shortness in her breathing when she has moved at all quickly. She looks very thin and pale. Her reserved nature occasions me great uneasiness of mind. It is useless to question her, you get no answers. It is still more useless to recommend remedies, they are never adopted. Nor can I shut my eyes to Anne's great delicacy of constitution. The late sad event has, I feel, made me more apprehensive than common. I cannot help feeling much depressed sometimes. I try to leave all in God's hands, to trust in his goodness, but faith and resignation are difficult to practice under some circumstances. The weather has been most unfavourable for invalids of late. Sudden changes of temperature and cold penetrating winds have been frequent here. Should the atmosphere become more settled, perhaps a favourable effect might be produced on the general health, and these harassing colds and coughs be removed. Papa has not quite escaped, but he has so far stood it better than any of us. You must not mention my going to this winter. I could not and would not leave home on any account. Miss has been for some years out of health now. These things make one feel, as well as know, that this world is not our abiding place. We should not knit human ties too close, or clasp human affections too fondly. They must leave us, or we must leave them one day. God restore health and strength to all who need it. I go on now with her own affecting words in the biographical notice of her sisters. But a great change approached. Affliction came in that shape which to anticipate is dread, to look back on grief. In the very heat and burden of the day, the labourers failed over their work. My sister Emily first declined. Never in all her life had she lingered over any task that lay before her, and she did not linger now. She sank rapidly. She made haste to leave us. Day by day, when I saw with what affront she met suffering, I looked on her with an anguish of wonder and love. I have seen nothing like it, but indeed I have never seen her parallel in anything. Stronger than a man, simpler than a child, her nature stood alone. The awful point was that, while full of ruth for others, on herself she had no pity. The spirit was inexorable to the flesh. From the trembling hands, the unnerved limbs, the fading eyes, the same service was exacted as they had rendered in health. To stand by and witness this, and not dare to remonstrate, was a pain no words can render. In fact, Emily never went out of doors after the Sunday succeeding Branwell's death. She made no complaint. She would not endure questioning. She rejected sympathy and help. Many a time did Charlotte and Anne drop their sewing or cease from their writing to listen with wrung hearts to the failing step, the laboured breathing, the frequent pauses with which their sister climbed the short staircase, yet they dared not notice what they observed, with pangs of suffering even deeper than hers. They dared not notice it in words, far less by the caressing assistance of a helping arm or hand. They sat still and silent. November 23rd, 1848. I told you Emily was ill in my last letter. She has not rallied yet. She is very ill. I believe if you were to see her, your impression would be that there is no hope. A more hollow, wasted, pallid aspect I have not beheld. The deep, tight cough continues, the breathing after the least exertion is a rapid pant, and these symptoms are accompanied by pains in the chest and side. Her pulse, the only time she allowed it to be felt, was found to beat 115 per minute. In this state she resolutely refuses to see a doctor. She will give no explanation of her feelings. She will scarcely allow her feelings to be alluded to. Our position is, and has been for some weeks, exquisitely painful. God only knows how all this is to terminate. More than once I have been forced boldly to regard the terrible event of her loss as possible, and even probable. But nature shrinks from such thoughts. I think Emily seems the nearest thing to my heart in the world. When a doctor had been sent for and was in the very house, Emily refused to see him. Her sisters could only describe to him what symptoms they had observed, and the medicines which he sent she would not take, denying that she was ill. December 10th, 1848. I hardly know what to say to you about the subject which now interests me the most keenly of anything in this world, for in truth I hardly know what to think myself. Hope and fear fluctuate daily. The pain in her side and chest is better. The cough, the shortness of breath, the extreme emaciation continue. I have endured, however, such tortures of uncertainty on this subject that at length I could endure it no longer. And as her repugnance to seeing a medical man continues immutable, as she declares no poisoning doctor shall come near her, I have written unknown to her to an eminent physician in London, giving as minute a statement of her case and symptoms as I could draw up, and requesting an opinion. I expect an answer in a day or two. I am thankful to say that my own health at present is very tolerable. It is well such is the case, for Anne, with the best will in the world to be useful, is really too delicate to do or bear much. She too at present has frequent pains in the side. Papa is also pretty well, though Emily's state renders him very anxious. The Blanks, Anne Bronte's former pupils, were here about a week ago. They are attractive and stylish-looking girls. They seemed overjoyed to see Anne. When I went into the room they were clinging round her like two children. She, meantime, looking perfectly quiet and passive. I and H. took it into their heads to come here. I think it probable offence was taken on that occasion, from what cause I know not, and as, if such be the case, the grudge must rest upon purely imaginary grounds, and since, besides, I have other things to think about, my mind rarely dwells upon the subject. If Emily were but well, I feel as if I should not care who neglected, misunderstood, or abused me. I would rather you were not of the number, either. The crab cheese arrived safely. Emily has just reminded me to thank you for it. It looks very nice. I wish she were well enough to eat it. But Emily was growing rapidly worse. I remember Miss Bronte's shiver at recalling the pang she felt when, after having searched in the little hollows and sheltered crevices of the moors for a lingering spray of heather, just one spray, however withered, to take into Emily, she saw that the flower was not recognised by the dim and indifferent eyes. Yet to the last Emily adhered tenaciously to her habits of independence. She would suffer no one to assist her. Any effort to do so roused the old stern spirit. One Tuesday morning in December she arose and dressed herself as usual, making many a pause, but doing everything for herself, and even endeavouring to take up her employment of sewing. The servants looked on, and knew what the catching, rattling breath and the glazing of the eye too surely foretold, but she kept at her work, and Charlotte and Anne, though full of unspeakable dread, had still the faintest spark of hope. On that morning Charlotte wrote thus, probably in the very presence of her dying sister. Tuesday. I should have written to you before, if I had had one word of hope to say, but I have not. She grows daily weaker. The physician's opinion was expressed too obscurely to be of use. He sent some medicine which she would not take. Moments so dark as these I have never known. I pray for God's support to us all. Hitherto he has granted it. The morning drew on to noon. Emily was worse. She could only whisper in gasps. Now, when it was too late, she said to Charlotte, "If you will send for a doctor, I will see him now." About 2:00 she died. December 21st, 1848. Emily suffers no more from pain or weakness now. She never will suffer more in this world. She is gone, after a hard, short conflict. She died on Tuesday, the very day I wrote to you. I thought it very possible she might be with us still for weeks, and a few hours afterwards she was in eternity. Yes, there is no Emily in time or on earth now. Yesterday we put her poor, wasted, mortal frame quietly under the church pavement. We are very calm at present. Why should we be otherwise? The anguish of seeing her suffer is over. The spectacle of the pains of death is gone by. The funeral day is past. We feel she is at peace. No need now to tremble for the hard frost and the keen wind. Emily does not feel them. She died in a time of promise. We saw her taken from life in its prime. But it is God's will, and the place where she is gone is better than that she has left. God has sustained me in a way that I marvel at, through such agony as I had not conceived. I now look at Anne, and wish she were well and strong, but she is neither, nor is Papa. Could you now come to us for a few days? I would not ask you to stay long. Write and tell me if you could come next week, and by what train. I would try to send a gig for you to Keighley. You will, I trust, find us tranquil. Try to come. I never so much needed the consolation of a friend's presence. Pleasure, of course, there would be none for you in the visit, except what your kind heart would teach you to find in doing good to others. As the old bereaved father and his 2 surviving children followed the coffin to the grave, they were joined by Keeper, Emily's fierce, faithful bulldog. He walked alongside of the mourners and into the church, and stayed quietly there all the time that the burial service was being read. When he came home, he lay down at Emily's chamber door and howled pitifully for many days. Anne Brontë drooped and sickened more rapidly from that time, and so ended the year 1848. End of section 4.
Section 5 of the Life of Charlotte Brontë. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie van Wallichem. The Life of Charlotte Brontë by Elizabeth Gaskell. Volume 2, Section 5. Chapter 3. An article on Vanity Fair and Jane Eyre had appeared in the Quarterly Review of December 1848. Some weeks after, Miss Brontë wrote to her publishers, asking why it had not been sent to her, and conjecturing that it was unfavourable, she repeated her previous request, that whatever was done with the laudatory, all critiques adverse to the novel might be forwarded to her without fail. The Quarterly Review was accordingly sent. I am not aware that Miss Brontë took any greater notice of the article than to place a few sentences out of it in the mouth of a hard and vulgar woman in Shirley, where they are so much in character that few have recognized them as a quotation. The time when the article was read was good for Miss Brontë. She was numbed to all petty annoyances by the grand severity of death. Otherwise she might have felt more keenly than they deserved the criticisms which, while striving to be severe, failed in logic owing to the misuse of prepositions, and have smarted under conjectures as to the authorship of Jane Eyre, which, intended to be acute, were merely flippant. But flippancy takes a graven name when directed against an author by an anonymous writer. We call it then cowardly insolence. Every one has a right to form his own conclusion respecting the merits and demerits of a book. I complain not of the judgment which the reviewer passes on Jane Eyre. Opinions as to its tendency varied then as they do now. While I write, I receive a letter from a clergyman in America in which he says, "We have in our sacred of sacreds a special shelf highly adorned as a place we delight to honor of novels which we recognize as having had a good influence on character, our character. Foremost is Jane Eyre." Nor do I deny the existence of a diametrically opposite judgment, and so, as I trouble not myself about the reviewer's style of composition, I leave his criticisms regarding the merits of the work on one side. But when, forgetting the chivalrous spirit of the good and noble Southey, who said, "In reviewing anonymous works myself, when I have known the authors, I have never mentioned them, taking it for granted they had sufficient reasons for avoiding the publicity," the quarterly reviewer goes on into gossiping conjectures as to whom Currer Bell really is, and pretends to decide on what the writer may be from the book. I protest with my whole soul against such want of Christian charity. Not even the desire to write a smart article, which shall be talked about in London, when the faint mask of the anonymous can be dropped at pleasure if the cleverness of the review be admired, not even this temptation can excuse the stabbing cruelty of the judgment. Who is he that should say of an unknown woman, "She must be one who for some sufficient reason has long forfeited the society of her sex"? Is he one who has led a wild and struggling and isolated life, seeing few but plain and outspoken northerns, unskilled in the euphemisms which assist the polite world to skim over the mention of vice? Has he striven through long weeping years to find excuses for the lapse of an only brother, and through daily contact with the poor lost profligate been compelled into a certain familiarity with the vices that his soul abhors? Has he, through trials, close following in dread march through his household, sweeping the hearthstone bare of life and love, still striven hard for strength to say, "It is the Lord, let him do what seems to him good," and sometimes striven in vain until the kindly light returned? If through all these dark waters the scornful reviewer have passed clear, refined, free from stain, with a soul that has never in all its agonies cried, "Lama sabachthani," still even then let him pray with the publican rather than judge with the Pharisee. January 10th, 1849. Anne had a very tolerable day yesterday, and a pretty quiet night last night, though she did not sleep much. Mr. Wheelhouse ordered the blister to be put on again. She wore it without sickness. I have just dressed it, and she has risen and come downstairs. She looks somewhat pale and sickly. She has had one dose of the cod-liver oil. It smells and tastes like train oil. I am training to hope, but the day is windy, cloudy, and stormy. My spirits fall at intervals very low. Then I look where you counsel me to look, beyond earthly tempests and sorrows. I seem to get strength, if not consolation. It will not do to anticipate. I feel that hourly. In the night I awake and long for morning, then my heart is wrung. Papa continues much the same. He was very faint when he came down to breakfast. Dear E., your friendship is some comfort to me. I am thankful for it. I see few lights through the darkness of the present time, but amongst them the constancy of a kind heart attached to me is one of the most cheering and serene. January 15th, 1849. I can scarcely say that Anne is worse, nor can I say she is better. She varies often in the course of a day, yet each day is passed pretty much the same. The morning is usually the best time, the afternoon and the evening the most feverish. Her cough is the most troublesome at night, but it is rarely violent. The pain in her arm still disturbs her. She takes the cod-liver oil and carbonate of iron regularly. She finds them both nauseous, but especially the oil. Her appetite is small indeed. Do not fear that I shall relax in my care of her. She is too precious not to be cherished with all the fostering strength I have. Papa, I am thankful to say, has been a good deal better this last day or two. As to your queries about myself, I can only say that if I continue as I am, I shall do very well. I have not yet got rid of the pains in my chest and back. They oddly return with every change of weather, and are still sometimes accompanied with a little soreness and hoarseness, but I combat them steadily with pitch plasters and brand tea. I should think it silly and wrong indeed not to be regardful of my own health at present. It would not do to be ill now. I avoid looking forward or backward, and try to keep looking upward. This is not the time to regret, dread, or weep. What I have and ought to do is very distinctly laid out for me. What I want and pray for is strength to perform it. The days pass in a slow, dark march. The nights are the test, the sudden wakings from restless sleep, the revived knowledge that one lies in her grave, and another not at my side, but in a separate and sick bed. However, God is over all. January 22nd, 1849. Anne really did seem to be a little better during some mild days last week, but to-day she looks very pale and languid again. She perseveres with the cod-liver oil, but still finds it very nauseous. She is truly obliged to you for the soles for her shoes, and finds them extremely comfortable. I am to commission you to get her just such a respirator as Mrs. had. She would not object to give a higher price, if you thought it better. If it is not too much trouble, you may likewise get me a pair of soles. You can send them and the respirator when you send the box. You must put down the price of all, and we will pay you in a post-office order. With the ring Hyde's was given to you, I have sent neither letter nor parcel. I had nothing but dreary news to write, so preferred that others should tell her. I have not written to either. I cannot write, except when I am quite obliged. February 11th, 1849. We received the box and its contents quite safely to-day. The pen-wipers are very pretty, and we are very much obliged to you for them. I hope the respirator will be useful to Anne, in case she should ever be well enough to go out again. She continues very much in the same state. I trust not greatly worse, though she is becoming very thin. I fear it would be only self-delusion to fancy her better. What effect the advancing season may have on her, I know not. Perhaps the return of really warm weather may give nature a happy stimulus. I tremble at the thought of any change to cold wind or frost. Would that March were well over! Her mind seems generally serene, and her sufferings hitherto are nothing like Emily's. The thought of what may be to come grows more familiar to my mind, but it is a sad, dreary guest. March 16th, 1849. We have found the past week a somewhat trying one. It has not been cold, but still there have been changes of temperature whose effect Anne has felt unfavourably. She is not, I trust, seriously worse, but her cough is at times very hard and painful, and her strength rather diminished than improved. I wish the month of March was well over. You are right in conjecturing that I am somewhat depressed. At times I certainly am. It was almost easier to bear up when the trial was at its crisis than now. The feeling of Emily's loss does not diminish as time wears on. It often makes itself most acutely recognized. It brings, too, an inexpressible sorrow with it. And then the future is dark. Yet I am well aware it will not do either to complain or sing, and I strive to do neither. Strength, I hope and trust, will yet be given in proportion to the burden, but the pain of my position is not one likely to lessen with habit. Its solitude and isolation are oppressive circumstances, yet I do not wish for any friends to stay with me. I could not do with any one, not even you, to share the sadness of the house. It would wreck me intolerably. Meantime judgment is still blent with mercy, and sufferings still continue mild. It is my nature, when left alone, to struggle on with a certain perseverance, and I believe God will help me. Anne had been delicate all her life, a fact which perhaps made them less aware than they would otherwise have been of the true nature of those fatal first symptoms. Yet they seemed to have lost but little time before they sent for the first advice that could be procured. She was examined with the stethoscope, and the dreadful fact was announced that her lungs were affected, and that tubercular consumption had already made considerable progress. A system of treatment was prescribed, which was afterwards ratified by the opinion of Dr. Forbes. For a short time they hoped that the disease was arrested. Charlotte, herself ill with a complaint that severely tried her spirits, was the ever watchful nurse of this youngest last sister. One comfort was, that Anne was the patientest, gentlest invalid that could be. Still there were hours, days, weeks of inexpressible anguish to be borne, under the pressure of which Charlotte could only pray, and pray she did, right earnestly. Thus she writes on March 24th. Anne's decline is gradual and fluctuating, but its nature is not doubtful. In spirit she is resigned, at heart she is, I believe, a true Christian. May God support her and all of us through the trial of lingering sickness, and aid her in the last hour when the struggle which separates soul from body must be gone through. We saw Emily torn from the midst of us, when our hearts clung to her with intense attachment. She was scarce buried when Anne's health failed. These things would be too much, if reason unsupported by religion were condemned to bear them alone. I have cause to be most thankful for the strength that has hitherto been vouchsafed both to my father and to myself. God, I think, is especially merciful to old age, and for my own part, trials which in perspective would have seemed to me quite intolerable, when they actually came, I endured without prostration. Yet I must confess that in the time which has elapsed since Emily's death, there have been moments of solitary, deep, inert affliction, far harder to bear than those which immediately followed our loss. The crisis of bereavement has an acute pang which goads to exertion. The desolate after-feeling sometimes paralyzes. I have learned that we are not to find solace in our own strength. We must seek it in God's omnipotence. Fortitude is good, but fortitude itself must be shaken under us to teach us how weak we are. All through this illness of Anne's, Charlotte had the comfort of being able to talk to her about her state, a comfort rendered inexpressibly great by the contrast which it presented to the recollection of Emily's rejection of all sympathy. If a proposal for Anne's benefit was made, Charlotte could speak to her about it, and the nursing and dying sister could consult with each other as to its desirability. I have seen but one of Anne's letters. It is the only time we seem to be brought into direct personal contact with this gentle, patient girl. In order to give the requisite preliminary explanation, I must state that the family of friends to which E. belonged proposed that Anne should come to them, in order to try what change of air and diet and the company of kindly people could do towards restoring her to health. In answer to this proposal, Charlotte writes, March 24th. I read your kind note to Anne, and she wishes me to thank you sincerely for your friendly proposal. She feels, of course, that it would not do to take advantage of it by quartering an invalid upon the inhabitants of Blank, but she intimates there is another way in which you might serve her, perhaps with some benefit to yourself as well as to her. Should it, a month or two hence, be deemed advisable that she should go either to the seaside or to some inland watering place, and should papa be disinclined to move, and I consequently obliged to remain at home, she asks, could you be her companion? Of course I need not add that in the event of such an arrangement being made, you would be put to no expense. This, dear E., is Anne's proposal. I make it to comply with her wish, but for my own part I must add that I see serious objections to your accepting it, objections I cannot name to her. She continues to vary, is sometimes worse, and sometimes better, as the weather changes, but on the whole I fear she loses strength. Papa says her state is most precarious. She may be spared for some time, or a sudden alteration might remove her before we are aware. Were such an alteration to take place while she was far from home and alone with you, it would be terrible. The idea of it distresses me inexpressibly, and I tremble whenever she alludes to the project of a journey. In short, I wish we could gain time and see how she gets on. If she leaves home, it certainly should not be in the capricious month of May, which is proverbially trying to the weak. June would be a safer month. If we could reach June, I should have good hopes of her getting through the summer. Write such an answer to this note as I can show Anne. You can write any additional remarks to me on a separate piece of paper. Do not consider yourself as confined to discussing only our said affairs. I am interested in all that interests you. From Anne Brontë. April 5th, 1849. My dear Miss Blank, I thank you greatly for your kind letter, and your ready compliance with my proposal, as far as the will can go at least. I see, however, that your friends are unwilling that you should undertake the responsibility of accompanying me under present circumstances. But I do not think there would be any great responsibility in the matter. I know, and everybody knows, that you would be as kind and helpful as any one could possibly be, and I hope I should not be very troublesome. It would be as a companion, not as a nurse, that I should wish for your company. Otherwise I should not venture to ask it. As for your kind and often repeated invitation to Blank, pray give my sincere thanks to your mother and sisters, but tell them I could not think of inflicting my presence upon them as I now am. It is very kind of them to make so light of the trouble, but still there must be more or less, and certainly no pleasure, from the society of a silent invalid stranger. I hope, however, that Charlotte will by some means make it possible to accompany me after all. She is certainly very delicate, and greatly needs a change of air and scene to renovate her constitution. And then your going with me before the end of May is apparently out of the question, unless you are disappointed in your visitors, but I should be reluctant to wait till then, if the weather would at all permit an earlier departure. You say May is a trying month, and so say others. The earlier part is often cold enough, I acknowledge, but according to my experience, we are almost certain of some fine warm days in the latter half, when the laburnums and lilacs are in bloom, whereas June is often cold and July generally wet. But I have a more serious reason than this for my impatience of delay. The doctors say that change of air, or removal to a better climate, would hardly ever fail of success in consumptive cases, if the remedy were taken in time. But the reason why there are so many disappointments is that it is generally deferred till it is too late. Now I would not commit this error, and to say the truth, though I suffer much less from pain and fever than I did when you were with us, I am decidedly weaker and very much thinner. My cough still troubles me a good deal, especially in the night, and, what seems worse than all, I am subject to great shortness of breath on going upstairs or any slight exertion. Under these circumstances I think there is no time to be lost. I have no horror of death. If I thought it inevitable, I think I could quietly resign myself to the prospect, in the hope that you, dear Miss Blank, would give as much of your company as you possibly could to Charlotte, and be a sister to her in my stead. But I wish it would please God to spare me, not only for papa's and Charlotte's sakes, but because I long to do some good in the world before I leave it. I have many schemes in my head for future practice, humble and limited indeed, but still I should not like them all to come to nothing, and myself to have lived to so little purpose. But God's will be done. Remember me respectfully to your mother and sisters, and believe me, dear Miss Blank, yours most affectionately, Anne Brontë. It must have been about this time that Anne composed her last verses, before the desk was closed and the pen laid aside for ever. 1. I hoped that with the brave and strong my portion task might lie, to toil amid the busy throng with purpose pure and high. 2. But God has fixed another part, and he has fixed it well. I said so with my bleeding heart, when first the anguish fell. 3. Thou, God, hast taken our delight, our treasured hope, away. Thou bidst us now weep through the night, and sorrow through the day. 4. These weary hours will not be lost, these days of misery, these nights of darkness anguish tossed, can I but turn to thee. 5. With a secret labour to sustain, in humble patience, every blow, to gather fortitude from pain, and hope and holiness from woe. 6. Thus let me serve thee from my heart, whate'er may be my written fate, whether thus early to depart, or yet a while to wait. 7. If thou shouldst bring me back to life, more humbled I should be, more wise, more strengthened for the strife, more reft to lean on thee. 8. Should death be standing at the gate, thus should I keep my vow, but Lord, whatever be my fate, O let me serve thee now. End of section 5. Section 6 of the Life of Charlotte Brontë. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie van Wallichem. The Life of Charlotte Brontë by Elizabeth Gaskell. Volume 2, Section 6. I take Charlotte's own words as the best record of her thoughts and feelings during all this terrible time. April 12th. I read Anne's letter to you. It was touching enough, as you say. If there were no hope beyond this world, no eternity, no life to come, Emily's fate, and that which threatens Anne, would be heart-breaking. I cannot forget Emily's death-day. It becomes a more fixed, a darker, a more frequently recurring idea in my mind than ever. It was very terrible. She was torn, conscious, panting, reluctant, though resolute, out of a happy life. but it will not do to dwell on these things. I am glad your friends object to your going with Anne. It would never do. To speak truth, even if your mother and sisters had consented, I never could. It is not that there is any laborious attention to pay her. She requires and will accept but little nursing. But there would be hazard and anxiety of mind beyond what you ought to be subject to. If a month or 6 weeks hence she continues to wish for a change as much as she does now, I shall, dear Valente, go with her myself. It will certainly be my paramount duty. Other cares must be made subservient to that. I have consulted Mr. T. He does not object, and recommends Scarborough, which was Anne's own choice. I trust affairs may be so ordered that you may be able to be with us at least part of the time. Whether in lodgings or not, I should wish to be boarded. Providing oneself is, I think, an insupportable nuisance. I don't like keeping provisions in a cupboard, locking up, being pillaged, and all that. It is a petty, wearing annoyance. The progress of Anne's illness was slower than that of Emily's had been, and she was too unselfish to refuse trying means from which, if she herself had little hope of benefit, her friends might hereafter derive a mournful satisfaction. I began to flatter myself she was getting strength, but the change the frost has told upon her. She suffers more of late. Still her illness has none of the fearful rapid symptoms which appalled in Emily's case. Could she only get over the spring, I hope summer may do much for her, and then early removal to a warmer locality for the winter might at least prolong her life. Could we only reckon upon another year, I should be thankful. But can we do this for the healthy? A few days ago I wrote to have Dr. Forbes' opinion. He warned us against entertaining sanguine hopes of recovery. The cod-liver oil he considers a peculiarly efficacious medicine. He too disapproved of change of residence for the present. There is some feeble consolation in thinking we are doing the very best that can be done. The agony of forced total neglect is not now felt as during Emily's illness. Never may we be doomed to feel such agony again. It was terrible. I have felt much less of the disagreeable pains in my chest lately, and much less also of the soreness and hoarseness. I tried an application of hot vinegar, which seemed to do good. May 1st. I was glad to hear that when we go to Scarborough, you will be at liberty to go with us. But the journey and its consequences still continue a source of great anxiety to me. I must try to put it off 2 or 3 weeks longer if I can. Perhaps, by that time, the milder season may have given Anne more strength. Perhaps it will be otherwise. I cannot tell. The change to fine weather has not proved beneficial to her so far. She has sometimes been so weak and suffered so much from pain in the side during the last few days, that I have not known what to think. She may rally again, and be much better, but there must be some improvement before I can feel justified in taking her away from home. Yet the delay is painful, for as is always the case, I believe under her circumstances, she seems herself not half conscious of the necessity for such delay. She wonders, I believe, why I don't talk more about the journey. It grieves me to think she may even be hurt by my seeming tardiness. She is very much emaciated, far more than when you were with us. Her arms are no thicker than a little child's. The least exertion brings a shortness of breath. She goes out a little every day, but we creep rather than walk. Papa continues pretty well. I hope I shall be enabled to bear up. So far I have reason for thankfulness to God. May had come and brought the milder weather longed for, but Anne was worse for the very change. A little later on it became colder, and she rallied, and poor Charlotte began to hope that if May were once over, she might last for a long time. Miss Brontë wrote to engage the lodgings at Scarborough, a place which Anne had formerly visited with the family to whom she was governess. They took a good-sized sitting-room and an airy double-bed-room, both commanding a sea-view, in one of the best situations of the town. Money was as nothing in comparison with life. Besides, Anne had a small legacy left to her by her godmother, and they felt that she could not better employ this than in obtaining what might prolong life, if not restore health. On May 16th, Charlotte writes, "It is with a heavy heart I prepare, and earnestly do I wish the fatigue of the journey were well over. It may be borne better than I expect, for temporary stimulus often does much, but when I see the daily increasing weakness, I know not what to think. I fear you will be shocked when you see Anne, but be on your guard, dear E., not to express your feelings. Indeed, I can trust both your self-possession and your kindness. I wish my judgment sanctioned the step of going to Scarborough more fully than it does. You ask how I have arranged about leaving papa. I could make no special arrangement. He wishes me to go with Anne, and would not hear of Mr. N.'s coming, or anything of that kind. So I do what I believe is for the best, and leave the result to Providence." They planned to rest and spend the night at York, and, at Anne's desire, arranged to make some purchases there. Charlotte ends the letter to her friend, in which she tells her all this, with May 23rd. I wish it seemed less like a dreary mockery in us to talk of buying bonnets, etc. Anne was very ill yesterday. She had difficulty of breathing all day, even when sitting perfectly still. To-day she seems better again. I long for the moment to come when the experiment of the sea air will be tried. Will it do her good? I cannot tell. I can only wish. Oh, if it would please God to strengthen and revive Anne, how happy we might be together! His will, however, be done. The two sisters left Haworth on Thursday, May 24th. They were to have done so the day before, and had made an appointment with their friend to meet them at the Leeds station, in order that they might all proceed together. But on Wednesday morning Anne was so ill that it was impossible for the sisters to set out. Yet they had no means of letting their friend know of this, and she consequently arrived at Leeds station at the time specified. There she sat waiting for several hours. It struck her as strange at the time, and it almost seems ominous to her fancy now, that twice over, from two separate arrivals on the line by which she was expecting her friends, coffins were carried forth, and placed in hearses which were in waiting for their dead, as she was waiting for one in 4 days to become so. The next day she could bear suspense no longer, and set out for Haworth, reaching there just in time to carry the feeble, fainting invalid into the chairs which stood at the gate to take them down to Keighley. The servant, who stood at the parsonage gates, saw death written on her face, and spoke of it. Charlotte saw it, and did not speak of it. It would have been giving the dread too distinct a form, and if this last darling yearned for the change to Scarborough, go she should, however Charlotte's heart might be wrung by impending fear. The lady who accompanied them, Charlotte's beloved friend of more than 20 years, has kindly written out for me the following account of the journey and of the end. She left her home May 24th, 1849, died May 28th. Her life was calm, quiet, spiritual. Such was her end. Through the trials and fatigues of the journey, she evinced the pious courage and fortitude of a martyr. Dependence and helplessness were ever with her a far sorer trial than heart-racking pain. The first stage of our journey was to York, and here the dear invalid was so revived, so cheerful and so happy, we drew consolation, and trusted that at least temporary improvement was to be derived from the change which she had so longed for, and her friends had so dreaded for her. By her request we went to the Minster, and to her it was an overpowering pleasure, not for its own imposing and impressive grandeur only, but because it brought to her susceptible nature a vital and overwhelming sense of omnipotence. She said, while gazing at the structure, "A finite power can do this. What is he?" And here emotion stayed her speech, and she was hastened to a less exciting scene. Her weakness of body was great, but her gratitude for every mercy was greater. After such an exertion as walking to her bedroom, she would clasp her hands and raise her eyes in silent thanks, and she did this not to the exclusion of wonted prayer, for that too was performed on bended knee, ere she accepted the rest of her couch. On the 25th we arrived at Scarborough, our dear invalid having during the journey directed our attention to every prospect worthy of notice. On the 26th she drove on the sands for an hour, and lest the poor donkey should be urged by its driver to a greater speed than her tender heart thought right, she took the reins and drove herself. When joined by her friend, she was charging the boy master of the donkey to treat the poor animal well. She was ever fond of dumb things, and would give up her own comfort for them. On Sunday the 27th she wished to go to church, and her eye brightened with the thought of once more worshipping her God amongst her fellow creatures. We thought it prudent to dissuade her from the attempt, though it was evident her heart was longing to join in the public act of devotion and praise. She walked a little in the afternoon, and meeting with a sheltered and comfortable seat near the beach, she begged we would leave her and enjoy the various scenes near at hand, which were new to us but familiar to her. She loved the place, and wished us to share her preference. The evening closed in with the most glorious sunset ever witnessed. The castle on the cliff stood in proud glory, gilded by the rays of the declining sun. The distant ships glittered like burnished gold. The little boats near the beach heaved on the ebbing tide, inviting occupants. The view was grand beyond description. Anne was drawn in her easy chair to the window to enjoy the scene with us. Her face became illumined almost as much as the glorious scene she gazed upon. Little was said, for it was plain that her thoughts were driven by the imposing view before her to penetrate forwards to the regions of unfading glory. She again thought of public worship, and wished us to leave her and join those who were assembled at the house of God. We declined, gently urging the duty and pleasure of staying with her, who was now so dear and so feeble. On returning to her place near the fire, she conversed with her sister upon the propriety of returning to their home. She did not wish it for her own sake. She said she was fearing others might suffer more if her decease occurred where she was. She probably thought the task of accompanying her lifeless remains on a long journey was more than her sister could bear, more than the bereaved father could bear, were she borne home another and a third tenant of the family vault in the short space of 9 months. The night was passed without any apparent accession of illness. She rose at 7 o'clock, and performed most of her toilet herself, by her expressed wish. Her sister always yielded such points, believing it was the truest kindness not to press inability when it was not acknowledged. Nothing occurred to excite alarm till about 11 a.m. She then spoke of feeling a change. She believed she had not long to live. Could she reach home alive if we prepared immediately for departure? A physician was sent for. Her address to him was made with perfect composure. She begged him to say how long he thought she might live, not to fear speaking the truth, for she was not afraid to die. The doctor reluctantly admitted that the angel of death was already arrived, and that life was ebbing fast. She thanked him for his truthfulness, and he departed, to come again very soon. She still occupied her easy chair, looking so serene, so reliant there was no opening for grief as yet, though all knew the separation was at hand. She clasped her hands and reverently invoked a blessing from on high, first upon her sister, then upon her friend, to whom she said, "Be a sister in my stead. Give Charlotte as much of your company as you can." She then thanked each for her kindness and attention. Ere long the restlessness of approaching death appeared, and she was borne to the sofa. On being asked if she were easier, she looked gratefully at her questioner and said, "It is not you who can give me ease, but soon all will be well, through the merits of our Redeemer." Shortly after this, seeing that her sister could hardly restrain her grief, she said, "Take courage, Charlotte, take courage." Her faith never failed, and her eye never dimmed, till about 2 o'clock, when she calmly and without a sigh passed from the temporal to the eternal. So still and so hallowed were her last hours and moments. There was no thought of assistance or of dread. The doctor came and went 2 or 3 times. The hostess knew that death was near, yet so little was the house disturbed by the presence of the dying and the sorrow of those so nearly bereaved, that dinner was announced as ready through the half-opened door, as a living sister was closing the eyes of the dead one. She could now no more stay the welled-up grief of her sister with her emphatic and dying "Take courage," and it burst forth in brief but agonizing strength. Charlotte's affection, however, had another channel, and there it turned in thought, in care, and in tenderness. There was bereavement, but there was not solitude. Sympathy was at hand, and it was accepted. With calmness came the consideration of the removal of the dear remains to their home resting place. This melancholy task, however, was never performed, for the afflicted sister decided to lay the flower in the place where it had fallen. She believed that to do so would accord with the wishes of the departed. She had no preference for place. She thought not of the grave, for that is but the body's goal, but of all that is beyond it. Her remains rest where the south sun warms the now dear sod, where the ocean billows lave and strike the steep and turf-covered rock. Anne died on the Monday. On the Tuesday Charlotte wrote to her father, but knowing that his presence was required for some annual church solemnity at Haworth, she informed him that she had made all necessary arrangement for the interment, and that the funeral would take place so soon that he could hardly arrive in time for it. The surgeon who had visited Anne on the day of her death offered his attendance, but it was respectfully declined. Mr. Brontë wrote to urge Charlotte's longer stay at the seaside. Her health and spirits were sorely shaken, and much as he naturally longed to see his only remaining child, he felt it right to persuade her to take with a friend a few more weeks' change of scene, though even that could not bring change of thought. Late in June the friends returned homewards, parting rather suddenly, it would seem, from each other, when their paths diverged. July 1849. I intended to have written a line to you to-day, if I had not received yours. We did indeed part suddenly. It made my heart ache that you were severed without the time to exchange a word. And yet perhaps it was better. I got here a little before 8 o'clock. All was clean and bright waiting for me. Papa and the servants were well, and all received me with an affection which should have consoled. The dogs seemed in strange ecstasy. I am certain they regarded me as a harbinger of others. The dumb creatures thought that as I was returned, those who had been so long absent were not far behind. I left Papa soon, and went into the dining-room. I shut the door. I tried to be glad that I was come home. I have always been glad before, except once. Even then I was cheered. But this time joy was not to be the sensation. I felt that the house was all silent. The rooms were all empty. I remembered where the three were laid, in what narrow dark dwellings, never more to reappear on earth. So the sense of desolation and bitterness took possession of me. The agony that was to be undergone and was not to be avoided came on. I underwent it, and passed a dreary evening and night, and a mournful morrow. To-day I am better. I do not know how life will pass, but I certainly do feel confidence in him who has upheld me hitherto. Solitude may be cheered, and made endurable beyond what I can believe. The great trial is when evening closes and night approaches. At that hour we used to assemble in the dining-room. We used to talk. Now I sit by myself. Necessarily I am silent. I cannot help thinking of their last days, remembering their sufferings, and what they said and did, and how they looked in mortal affliction. Perhaps all this will become less poignant in time. Let me thank you once more, dear E., for your kindness to me, which I do not mean to forget. How did you think of looking at your home? Papa thought me a little stronger. He said my eyes were not so sunken. July 14th, 1849. I do not much like giving an account of myself. I like better to go out of myself and talk of something more cheerful. My cold, wherever I got it, whether at Easton or elsewhere, is not vanished yet. It began in my head. Then I had a sore throat, and then a sore chest with a cough, but only a trifling cough, which I still have at times. The pain between my shoulders likewise amazed me much. Say nothing about it, for I confess I am too much disposed to be nervous. This nervousness is a horrid phantom. I dare communicate no ailment to Papa. His anxiety harasses me inexpressibly. My life is what I expected it to be. Sometimes, when I wake in the morning, I know that solitude, remembrance, and longing are to be almost my sole companions all day through, that at night I shall go to bed with them, that they will long keep me sleepless, that next morning I shall wake to them again. Sometimes now I have a heavy heart of it. But crushed I am not yet, nor robbed of elasticity, nor of hope, nor quite of endeavour. I have some strength to fight the battle of life. I am aware, and can acknowledge, I have many comforts, many mercies. Still I can get on. But I do hope and pray that never may you or any one I love be placed as I am. To sit in a lonely room, the clock ticking loud through a still house, and have open before the mind's eye the record of the last year, with its shocks, sufferings, losses, is a trial. I write to you freely, because I believe you will hear me with moderation, that you will not take alarm, or think me in any way worse off than I am. End of Section 6.
Volume 2, Section 7 of the Life of Charlotte Brontë. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Charlotte Brontë by Elizabeth Gaskell. Volume 2, Section 7. The tale of Shirley had been begun soon after the publication of Jane Eyre. If the reader will refer to the account I have given of Miss Brontë's school days at Roe Head, he will there see how every place surrounding that house was connected with the Luddite riots, and will learn how stories and anecdotes of that time were rife among the inhabitants of the neighbouring villages; how Miss Wooler herself, and the elder relations of most of her schoolfellows, must have known the actors in those grim disturbances. What Charlotte had heard there as a girl came up in her mind, when, as a woman, she sought a subject for her next work, and she sent to Leeds for a file of the Mercuries of 1812, 13, and 14, in order to understand the spirit of those eventful times. She was anxious to write of things she had known and seen, and among the number was the West Yorkshire character, for which any tale laid among the Luddites would afford full scope. In Shirley, she took the idea of most of her characters from life, although the incidents and situations were, of course, fictitious. She thought that if these last were purely imaginary, she might draw from the real without detection, but in this she was mistaken. Her studies were too closely accurate. This occasionally led her into difficulties. People recognized themselves, or were recognized by others, in her graphic descriptions of their personal appearance, and modes of action and turns of thought, though they were placed in new positions, and figured away in scenes far different to those in which their actual life had been passed. Miss Brontë was struck by the force or peculiarity of the character of some one whom she knew. She studied it, and analysed it with subtle power, and having traced it to its germ, she took that germ as the nucleus of an imaginary character, and worked outwards, thus reversing the process of analysation, and unconsciously reproducing the same external development. The three curates were real living men, haunting Haworth and the neighbouring district, and so obtuse in perception that, after the first burst of anger at having their ways and habits chronicled was over, they rather enjoyed the joke of calling each other by the names she had given them. Mrs. Prior was well known to many who loved the original dearly. The whole family of the Yorks were, I have been assured, almost daguerreotypes. Indeed, Miss Brontë told me that, before publication, she had sent those parts of the novel in which these remarkable persons are introduced to one of the sons, and his reply, after reading it, was simply that she had not drawn them strong enough. From those many-sided sons I suspect she drew all that there was of truth in the characters of the heroes in her first two works. They, indeed, were almost the only young men she knew intimately, besides her brother. There was much friendship, and still more confidence between the Brontë family and them, although their intercourse was often broken and irregular. There was never any warmer feeling on either side. The character of Shirley herself is Charlotte's representation of Emily. I mention this because all that I, a stranger, have been able to learn about her, has not tended to give either me or my readers a pleasant impression of her. But we must remember how little we are acquainted with her, compared to that sister, who, out of her more intimate knowledge, says that she was genuinely good and truly great, and who tried to depict her character in Shirley Kildare, as what Emily Brontë would have been, had she been placed in health and prosperity. Miss Brontë took extreme pains with Shirley. She felt that the fame she had acquired imposed upon her a double responsibility. She tried to make her novel like a piece of actual life, feeling sure that if she but represented the product of personal experience and observation truly, good would come of it in the long run. She carefully studied the different reviews and criticisms that had appeared on Jane Eyre, in hopes of extracting precepts and advice from which to profit. Down into the very midst of her writing came the bolts of death. She had nearly finished the second volume of her tale when Branwell died. After him Emily, after her Anne. The pen, laid down when there were 3 sisters living and loving, was taken up when one alone remained. Well might she call the first chapter that she wrote after this, The Valley of the Shadow of Death. I knew in part what the unknown author of Shirley must have suffered, when I read those pathetic words which occur at the end of this and the beginning of the succeeding chapter. Till break of day, she wrestled with God in earnest prayer. Not always do those who dare such divine conflict prevail. Night after night, the sweat of agony may burst dark on the forehead. The supplicant may cry for mercy with that soundless voice the soul utters when its appeal is to the invisible. Spare my beloved, it may implore. Heal my life's life. Rend not from me what long affection entwines with my whole nature. God of heaven, bend, hear, be clement. And after this cry and strife, the sun may rise and see him worsted. That opening morn, which used to salute him with the whispers of zephyrs, the carol of skylarks, may breathe, as its first accents, from the dear lips which colour and heat have quitted. Oh, I have had a suffering night. This morning I am worse. I have tried to rise, I cannot. Dreams I am unused to have troubled me. Then the watcher approaches the patient's pillow, and sees a new and strange moulding of the familiar features, feels at once that this insufferable moment draws nigh, knows that it is God's will his idol should be broken, and bends his head, and subdues his soul to the sentence he cannot avert, and scarce can bear. No piteous, unconscious moaning sound, which so wastes our strength, that, even if we have sworn to be firm, a rush of unconquerable tears sweeps away the oath, preceded her waking. No space of deaf apathy followed. The first words spoken were not those of one becoming estranged from this world, and already permitted to stray at times into realms foreign to the living. She went on with her work steadily, but it was dreary to write without any one to listen to the progress of her tale, to find fault or to sympathize. While pacing the length of the parlour in the evenings, as in the days that were no more. 3 sisters had done this, then 2, the other sister dropping off from the walk, and now one was left desolate, to listen for echoing steps that never came, and to hear the wind sobbing at the windows with an almost articulate sound. But she wrote on, struggling against her own feelings of illness, continually recurring feelings of slight cold, slight soreness in the throat and chest, of which, do what I will, she writes, I cannot get rid. In August there arose a new cause for anxiety, happily but temporary. August 23rd, 1849. Papa has not been well at all lately. He has had another attack of bronchitis. I felt very uneasy about him for some days, more wretched indeed than I care to tell you. After what has happened, one trembles at any appearance of sickness, and when anything ails papa, I feel too keenly that he is the last the only near and dear relative I have in the world. Yesterday and to-day he has seemed much better, for which I am truly thankful. From what you say of Mr. I think I should like him very much. Wants shaken to be put out about his appearance. What does it matter whether her husband dines in a dress coat or a market coat, provided there be worth and honesty, and a clean shirt underneath? September 10th, 1849. My piece of work is at last finished, and dispatched to its destination. You must now tell me when there is a chance of your being able to come here. I fear it will now be difficult to arrange, as it is so near the marriage day. Note well, it would spoil all my pleasure if you put yourself, or any one else, to inconvenience to come to Haworth. But when it is convenient, I shall be truly glad to see you. Papa, I am thankful to say, is better, though not strong. He is often troubled with a sensation of nausea. My cold is very much less troublesome. I am sometimes quite free from it. A few days since, I had a severe bilious attack, the consequence of sitting too closely to my writing, but it is gone now. It is the first from which I have suffered since my return from the seaside. I had them every month before. September 13th, 1849. If duty and the well-being of others require that you should stay at home, I cannot permit myself to complain. Still I am very, very sorry that circumstances will not permit us to meet just now. I would without hesitation come too, if papa were stronger, but uncertain as are both his health and spirits, I could not possibly prevail on myself to leave him now. Let us hope that when we do see each other, our meeting will be all the more pleasurable for being delayed. Dear E., you certainly have a heavy burden laid on your shoulders, but such burdens, if well borne, benefit the character. Only we must take the greatest, closest, most watchful care not to grow proud of our strength, in case we should be enabled to bear up under the trial. That pride indeed would be sign of radical weakness. The strength, if strength we have, is certainly never in our own selves. It is given us. To W. S. Williams, Esquire, September 21st, 1849. My dear Sir, I am obliged to you for preserving my secret, being at least as anxious as ever, more anxious I cannot well be, in parenthesis, to keep quiet. You asked me in one of your letters lately, whether I thought I should escape identification at Yorkshire. I am so little known that I think I shall. Besides, the book is far less founded on the real than perhaps appears. It would be difficult to explain to you how little actual experience I have had of life, how few persons I have known, and how very few have known me. As an instance how the characters have been managed, take that of Mr. Helstone. If this character had an original, it was in the person of a clergyman who died some years since, at the advanced age of 80. I never saw him except once, at the consecration of a church, when I was a child of 10 years old. I was then struck with his appearance and stern, martial air. At a subsequent period I heard him talked about in the neighbourhood where he had resided. Some mention him with enthusiasm, others with detestation. I listened to various anecdotes, balanced evidence against evidence, and drew an inference. The original of Mr. Hall I have seen. He knows me slightly, but he would as soon think I had closely observed him or taken him for a character. He would as soon, indeed, suspect me of writing a hook, a novel, as he would his dog Prince. Margaret Hall called Jane Eyre a wicked book, on the authority of the Quarterly, an expression which, coming from her, I will here confess, struck somewhat deep. It opened my eyes to the harm the Quarterly had done. Margaret would not have called it wicked, if she had not been told so. No matter, whether known or unknown, misjudged or the contrary, I am resolved not to write otherwise. I shall bend as my powers tend. The two human beings who understood me, and whom I understood, are gone. I have some that love me yet, and whom I love, without expecting, or having a right to expect, that they shall perfectly understand me. I am satisfied, but I must have my own way in the matter of writing. The loss of what we possess, nearest and dearest to us in this world, produces an effect upon the character we search out what we have yet left that can support, and when found, we cling to it with a hold of new-strung tenacity. The faculty of imagination lifted me when I was sinking, 3 months ago. Its active exercise has kept my head above water since. Its results cheer me now, for I feel they have enabled me to give pleasure to others. I am thankful to God, who gave me the faculty, and it is for me a part of my religion to defend this gift, and to profit by its possession. Yours sincerely, Charlotte Brontë. At the time when this letter was written, both Tabby and the young servant whom they had to assist her were ill in bed, and with the exception of occasional aid, Miss Brontë had all the household work to perform, as well as to nurse the two invalids. The serious illness of the younger servant was at its height, when a cry from Tabby called Miss Brontë into the kitchen, and she found the poor old woman of 80 laid on the floor, with her head under the kitchen grate. She had fallen from her chair in attempting to rise. When I saw her 2 years later, she described to me the tender care which Charlotte had taken of her at this time, and wound up her account of how her own mother could not have had more thought for her nor Miss Brontë had, by saying, she's a good one, she is. But there was one day when the strung nerves gave way, when, as she says, I fairly broke down for 10 minutes, sat and cried like a fool. Tabby could neither stand nor walk. Papa had just been declaring that Martha was in imminent danger. I was myself depressed with headache and sickness. That day I hardly knew what to do, or where to turn. Thank God, Martha is now convalescent. Tabby, I trust, will be better soon. Papa is pretty well. I have the satisfaction of knowing that my publishers are delighted with what I sent them. This supports me, but life is a battle. May we all be enabled to fight it well. The kind friend to whom she thus wrote saw how the poor overtaxed system needed bracing, and accordingly sent her a shower bath, a thing for which she had long been wishing. The receipt of it was acknowledged as follows: September 28th, 1849. Martha is now almost well, and Tabby much better. A huge monster package from Nelson, Leeds, came yesterday. You want chastising roundly and soundly. Such are the thanks you get for all your trouble. Whenever you come to Haworth, you shall certainly have a thorough drenching in your own shower bath. I have not yet unpacked the wretch. Yours as you deserve, C.B. There was misfortune of another kind impending over her. There were some railway shares, which, so early as 1846, she had told Miss Wooler she wished to sell, but had kept because she could not persuade her sisters to look upon the affair as she did, and so preferred running the risk of loss, to hurting Emily's feelings, by acting in opposition to her opinion. The depreciation of these same shares was now verifying Charlotte's soundness of judgment. They were in the York and North Midland Company, which was one of Mr. Hudson's pet lines, and had the full benefit of his peculiar system of management. She applied to her friend and publisher, Mr. Smith, for information on the subject, and the following letter is in answer to his reply. October 4th, 1849. My dear Sir, I must not thank you for, but acknowledge the receipt of your letter. The business is certainly very bad, worse than I thought, and much worse than my father has any idea of. In fact, the little railway property I possessed, according to original prices, formed already a small competency for me, with my views and habits. Now, scarcely any portion of it can, with security, be calculated upon. I must open this view of the case to my father by degrees, and, meanwhile, wait patiently till I see how affairs are likely to turn. However the matter may terminate, I ought perhaps to be rather thankful than dissatisfied. When I look at my own case, and compare it with that of thousands besides, I scarcely see room for a murmur. Many, very many, are by the late strange railway system deprived almost of their daily bread. Such then as have only lost provision laid up for the future should take care how they complain. The thought that Shirley has given pleasure at Cornhill yields me much quiet comfort. No doubt, however, you are, as I am, prepared for critical severity. But I have good hopes that the vessel is sufficiently sound of construction to weather a gale or two, and to make a prosperous voyage for you in the end. Towards the close of October in this year, she went to pay a visit to her friend, but her enjoyment in the holiday which she had so long promised herself when her work was completed, was deadened by a continual feeling of ill health. Either the change of air, or the foggy weather, produced constant irritation at the chest. Moreover, she was anxious about the impression which her second work would produce on the public mind. For obvious reasons, an author is more susceptible to opinions pronounced on the book which follows a great success, than he has ever been before. Whatever be the value of fame, he has it in his possession, and is not willing to have it dimmed or lost. Shirley was published on October 26th. When it came out, but before reading it, Mr. Lewis wrote to tell her of his intention of reviewing it in the Edinburgh. Her correspondence with him had ceased for some time. Much had occurred since. To G. H. Lewis, Esquire. November 1st, 1849. My dear Sir, it is about a year and a half since you wrote to me, but it seems a longer period, because since then it has been my lot to pass some black milestones in the journey of life. Since then there have been intervals when I have ceased to care about literature, and critics, and fame, when I have lost sight of whatever was prominent in my thoughts at the first publication of Jane Eyre. But now I want these things to come back vividly, if possible. Consequently, it was a pleasure to receive your note. I wish you did not think me a woman. I wish all reviewers believed Currer Bell to be a man. They would be more just to him. You will, I know, keep measuring me by some standard of what you deem becoming to my sex. Where I am not what you consider graceful, you will condemn me. All mouths will be open against that first chapter, and that first chapter is true as the Bible, nor is it exceptionable. Come what will, I cannot, when I write, think always of myself and of what is elegant and charming in femininity. It is not on those terms, or with such ideas, I ever took pen in hand; and if it is only on such terms my writing will be tolerated, I shall pass away from the public and trouble it no more. Out of obscurity I came, to obscurity I can easily return. Standing afar off, I now watch to see what will become of Shirley. My expectations are very low, and my anticipations somewhat sad and bitter. Still, I earnestly conjure you to say honestly what you think. Flattery would be worse than vain. There is no consolation in flattery. As for condemnation, I cannot, on reflection, see why I should much fear it. There is no one but myself to suffer therefrom, and both happiness and suffering in this life soon pass away. Wishing you all success in your Scottish expedition, I am, dear Sir, yours sincerely, C. Bell. Miss Brontë, as we have seen, had been as anxious as ever to preserve her incognito in Shirley. She even fancied that there were fewer traces of a female pen in it than in Jane Eyre; and thus, when the earliest reviews were published, and asserted that the mysterious writer must be a woman, she was much disappointed. She especially disliked the lowering of the standard by which to judge a work of fiction, if it proceeded from a feminine pen. and praise mingled with pseudo-gallant allusions to her sex mortified her far more than actual blame. But the secret so jealously preserved was oozing out at last. The publication of Shirley seemed to fix the conviction that the writer was an inhabitant of the district where the story was laid, and a clever Haworth man, who had somewhat risen in the world and gone to settle in Liverpool, read the novel, and was struck with some of the names of places mentioned, and knew the dialect in which parts of it were written. He became convinced that it was the production of some one in Haworth, but he could not imagine who in that village could have written such a work except Miss Brontë. Proud of his conjecture, he divulged the suspicion, which was almost certainty, in the columns of a Liverpool paper. Thus the heart of the mystery came slowly creeping out, and a visit to London which Miss Brontë paid towards the end of the year 1849 made it distinctly known. She had been all along on most happy terms with her publishers, and their kindness had beguiled some of those weary, solitary hours which had so often occurred of late, by sending for her perusal boxes of books more suited to her taste than any she could procure from the circulating library at Keighley. She often writes such sentences as the following, in her letters to Cornhill: "I was indeed very much interested in the books you sent, Eckermann's Conversations with Goethe, Guesses as Truth, Friends in Council, and the little work on English social life, pleased me particularly, and the last not least. We sometimes take a partiality to books as to characters, not on account of any brilliant intellect or striking peculiarity they boast, but for the sake of something good, delicate, and genuine. I thought that small book the production of a lady, and an amiable, sensible woman, and I liked it. You must not think of selecting any more works for me yet. My stock is still far from exhausted. I accept your offer respecting the Athenaeum. It is a paper I should like much to see, providing that you can send it without trouble. It shall be punctually returned." In a letter to her friend, she complains of the feelings of illness from which she was seldom or never free. November 16th, 1849. You are not to suppose any of the characters in Shirley intended as literal portraits. It would not suit the rules of art, nor of my own feelings, to write in that style. We only suffer reality to suggest, never to dictate. The heroines are abstractions, and the heroes also. Qualities I have seen, loved, and admired, are here and there put in as decorative gems, to be preserved in that sitting. Since you say you could recognize the originals of all except the heroines, pray, whom do you suppose the two Moors to represent? I send you a couple of reviews. The one is the Examiner, written by Albany Fonblanque, who is called the most brilliant political writer of the day, a man whose dictum is much thought of in London. The other, in the Standard of Freedom, is written by William Howitt, a Quaker. I should be pretty well if it were not for headaches and indigestion. My chest has been better lately. In consequence of this long protracted state of languor, headache, and sickness, to which the slightest exposure to cold added sensations of hoarseness and soreness at the chest, she determined to take the evil in time, as much for her father's sake as for her own, and to go up to London and consult some physician there. It was not her first intention to visit anywhere, but the friendly urgency of her publishers prevailed, and it was decided that she was to become the guest of Mr. Smith. Before she went, she wrote 2 characteristic letters about Shirley, from which I shall take a few extracts. Shirley makes her way. The reviewers shower in fast. The best critique which has yet appeared is in the Revue des Deux Mondes, a sort of European cosmopolitan periodical, whose headquarters are at Paris. Comparatively few reviewers, even in their praise, evince a just comprehension of the author's meaning. Eugene Forcade, the reviewer in question, follows Currer Bell through every winding, discerns every point, discriminates every shade, proves himself master of the subject, and lord of the aim. With that man I would shake hands if I saw him. I would say, "You know me, monsieur. I shall deem it an honour to know you." I could not say so much of the mass of the London critics. Perhaps I could not say so much to 500 men and women in all the millions of Great Britain. That matters little. My own conscience I satisfy first. And having done that, if I further content and delight a Froissart, a Fonblanc, and a Thackeray, my ambition has had its ration. It is fed. It lies down for the present satisfied. My faculties have wrought a day's task and earned a day's wages. I am no teacher. To look on me in that light is to mistake me. To teach is not my vocation. What I am, it is useless to say. Those whom it concerns feel and find it out. To all others I wish only to be an obscure, steady-going, private character. To you, dear E., I wish to be a sincere friend. Give me your faithful regard. I willingly dispense with admiration. November 26th. It is like you to pronounce the reviews not good enough, and belongs to that part of your character which will not permit you to bestow unqualified approbation on any dress, decoration, etc., belonging to you. Know that the reviews are superb, and were I dissatisfied with them, I should be a conceited ape. Nothing higher is ever said, from perfectly disinterested motives, of any living authors. If all be well, I go to London this week, Wednesday, I think. The dressmaker has done my small matters pretty well, but I wish she could have looked them over, and given a dictum. I insisted on the dresses being made quite plainly. At the end of November she went up to the big Babylon, and was immediately plunged into what appeared to her a whirl. For changes in scenes and stimulus, which would have been a trifle to others, were much to her. As was always the case with strangers, she was a little afraid at first of the family into which she was now received, fancying that the ladies looked on her with a mixture of respect and alarm. But in a few days, if this state of feeling ever existed, her simple, shy, quiet manners, her dainty personal and household ways, had quite done away with it, and she says that she thinks they began to like her, and that she likes them much, for kindness is a potent heart-winner. She had stipulated that she should not be expected to see many people. The recluse life she had led was the cause of a nervous shrinking from meeting any fresh face, which lasted all her life long. Still she longed to have an idea of the personal appearance and manners of some of those whose writings or letters had interested her. Mr. Thackeray was accordingly invited to meet her, but it so happened that she had been out of the greater part of the morning, and in consequence missed the luncheon hour at her friend's house. This brought on a severe and depressing headache in one accustomed to the early regular hours of a Yorkshire parsonage. Besides, the excitement of meeting, hearing, and sitting next to a man to whom she looked up with such admiration as she did to the author of Vanity Fair, was of itself overpowering to her frail nerves. She writes about this dinner as follows: December 10th, 1849. As to being happy, I am under scenes and circumstances of excitement, but I suffer acute pain sometimes. Mental pain, I mean. At the moment Mr. Thackeray presented himself, I was thoroughly faint from inanition, having eaten nothing since a very slight breakfast, and it was then 7 o'clock in the evening. Excitement and exhaustion made savage work of me that evening. What he thought of me I cannot tell. She told me how difficult she found it, this first time of meeting Mr. Thackeray, to decide whether he was speaking in jest or in earnest, and that she had, she believed, completely misunderstood an inquiry of his, made on the gentlemen's coming into the drawing-room. He asked her if she had perceived the secret of their cigars, to which she replied literally, discovering in a minute afterwards, by the smile on several faces, that he was alluding to a passage in Jane Eyre. Her host took pleasure in showing her the sights of London. On one of the days which had been set apart for some of these pleasant excursions, a severe review of Shirley had been published in the Times. She had heard that her book would be noticed by it, and guessed that there was some particular reason for the care with which her hosts mislaid it on that particular morning. She told them that she was aware why she might not see the paper. Mrs. Smith at once admitted that her conjecture was right, and said that they had wished her to go to the day's engagement before reading it. But she quietly persisted in her request to be allowed to have the paper. Mrs. Smith took her work, and tried not to observe the countenance which the other tried to hide between the large sheets. But she could not help becoming aware of tears stealing down the face and dropping on the lap. The first remark Miss Brontë made was to express her fear lest so severe a notice should check the sale of the book, and injuriously affect her publishers. Wounded as she was, her first thought was for others. Later on, I think that very afternoon, Mr. Thackeray called. She suspected, she said, that he came to see how she bore the attack on Shirley. But she had recovered her composure, and conversed very quietly with him. He only learnt from the answer to his direct inquiry that she had read the Times article. She acquiesced in the recognition of herself as the authoress of Jane Eyre, because she perceived that there were some advantages to be derived from dropping her pseudonym. One result was an acquaintance with Miss Martineau. She had sent her the novel just published, with a curious note, in which Currer Bell offered a copy of Shirley to Miss Martineau, as an acknowledgment of the gratification he had received from her works. From Deerbrook he had derived a new and keen pleasure, and experienced a genuine benefit. In his mind, Deerbrook, etc. Miss Martineau, in acknowledging this note, and the copy of Shirley, dated her letter from a friend's house in the neighbourhood of Mr. Smith's residence, and when a week or two afterwards Miss Brontë found how near she was to her correspondent, she wrote, in the name of Currer Bell, to propose a visit to her. 6 o'clock on a certain Sunday afternoon, December 10th, was the time appointed. Miss Martineau's friends had invited the unknown Currer Bell to their early tea. They were ignorant whether the name was that of a man or a woman, and had had various conjectures as to sex, age, and appearance. Miss Martineau had, indeed, expressed her private opinion pretty distinctly by beginning her reply, to the professedly masculine note referred to above, with "Dear Madam," but she had addressed it to Currer Bell, Esquire. At every ring the eyes of the party turned towards the door. Some stranger, a gentleman, I think, came in. For an instant they fancied he was Currer Bell, and indeed an Esquire. He stayed some time, went away. Another ring. Miss Brontë was announced, and in came a young-looking lady, almost childlike in stature, in a deep mourning dress, neat as a Quaker's, with her beautiful hair smooth and brown, her fine eyes blazing with meaning, and her sensible face indicating a habit of self-control. She came, hesitated one moment at finding 4 or 5 people assembled, then went straight to Miss Martineau, with intuitive recognition, and with the freemasonry of good feeling and gentle breeding, she soon became as one of the family seated round the tea-table. And before she left, she told them, in a simple, touching manner, of her sorrow and isolation, and a foundation was laid for her intimacy with Miss Martineau. After some discussion on the subject, and a stipulation that she should not be specially introduced to any one, some gentlemen were invited by Mr. Smith to meet her at dinner the evening before she left town. Her natural place would have been at the bottom of the table by her host, and the places of those who were to be her neighbours were arranged accordingly. But, on entering the dining-room, she quickly passed up so as to sit next to the lady of the house, anxious to shelter herself near some one of her own sex. This same womanly, seeking after protection on every occasion, when there was no moral duty involved in asserting her independence, that made her about this time write as follows. Mrs. watches me very narrowly when surrounded by strangers. She never takes her eye from me. I like the surveillance. It seems to keep guard over me. Respecting this particular dinner-party, she thus wrote to the Brussels schoolfellow of former days, whose friendship had been renewed during her present visit to London. "The evening after I left you passed better than I expected. Thanks to my substantial lunch and cheering cup of coffee, I was able to wait the 8 o'clock dinner with complete resignation, and to endure its length quite courageously, nor was I too much exhausted to converse. And of this I was glad, for otherwise I know my kind host and hostess would have been much disappointed. There were only 7 gentlemen at dinner, besides Mr. Smith, but of these 5 were critics, men more dreaded in the world of letters than you can conceive. I did not know how much their presence and conversation had excited me till they were gone, and the reaction commenced. When I had retired for the night, I wished to sleep. The effort to do so was vain. I could not close my eyes. Night passed, morning came, and I rose without having known a moment's slumber. So utterly worn out was I when I got to Derby, that I was again obliged to stay there all night. December 17th. Here I am at Haworth once more. I feel as if I had come out of an exciting whirl. Not that the hurry and stimulus would have seemed much to one accustomed to society and change, but to me they were very marked. My strength and spirits too often proved quite insufficient to the demand on their exertions. I used to bear up as long as I possibly could, for when I flagged, I could see Mr. Smith became disturbed. He always thought that something had been said or done to annoy me, which never once happened, for I met with perfect good breeding even from antagonists, men who had done their best or worst to write me down. I explained to him over and over again that my occasional silence was only failure of the power to talk, never of the will. Thackeray is a Titan of mind. His presence and powers impress one deeply in an intellectual sense. I do not see him or know him as a man. All the others are subordinate. I have esteem for some, and I trust courtesy for all. I do not, of course, know what they thought of me, but I believe most of them expected me to come out in a more marked, eccentric, striking light. I believe they desired more to admire and more to blame. I felt sufficiently at my ease with all but Thackeray. With him I was fearfully stupid. She returned to her quiet home and her noiseless daily duties. Her father had quite enough of the spirit of hero-worship in him to make him take a vivid pleasure in the accounts of what she had heard and whom she had seen. It was on the occasion of one of her visits to London that he had desired her to obtain a sight of Prince Albert's armoury, if possible. I am not aware whether she managed to do this, but she went to one or two of the great national armouries, in order that she might describe the stern steel harness and glittering swords to her father, whose imagination was forcibly struck by the idea of such things; and often afterwards, when his spirits flagged, and the languor of old age for a time got the better of his indomitable nature, she would again strike on the measure wild, and speak about the armies of strange weapons she had seen in London, till he resumed his interest in the old subject, and was his own keen, warlike, intelligent self again. End of Section 7.